Hello, I'm Will. Welcome to ResearchPod. In 2020, the US FDA granted 39 new or expanded approvals for cancer treatments. In the same year, there were an estimated 1.8 million new cancer cases and 600,000 deaths from the disease. Meanwhile, the NHS in the UK estimates that half of people living today will develop some form of cancer in their lifetime. These are all big numbers, comprising the lives of millions upon millions of people affected, directly or indirectly, by a disease originating from within their very own cells. Against that backdrop, Professor David Stewart, medical oncologist and professor of medicine at the University of Ottawa and Ottawa Hospital, has compiled his decades of clinical experience, practice, and research into the new book, Why Cancer Still Sucks. Today we're talking about what it's like for patients and families facing diagnosis, what to look out for in finding proven effective treatments, and when, or rather if, things are going to get better. Dr. David, hello.
Hi, how are you?
I am doing okay. Thank you very much for your time to join us. If you could start off with a little bit about you, the person behind the research, the person behind the book. What's led to writing this book now and why it's you writing it?
I've been a medical oncologist now for more than 40 years. I came from Ottawa, the Ottawa region in Canada originally, but did my oncology training at MD Anderson Hospital in Houston, Texas, and then back up here in 2011 as head of the Division of Medical Oncology. And I was head of the division until 2019, and I've just kept on as a medical oncologist and at the University of Ottawa here. So as far as why writing the book, I've been telling my wife for the last 20 years I was going to write it, but it was only about 2019 that I actually started to do it. And the reason for it is because twofold. The questions that my patients have when I meet with them, and just to try to explain things to them. And what they often tell me is that uncertainty is worse than bad news. If they've got bad news, then they can figure out how to deal with it. If they've got uncertainty, that's much worse. And so it's just to give them a bit more education, a bit more insight into why things are the way they are. And many patients find that that's helpful. Some of them actually find it very scary, but the majority find it very helpful. So that was one reason. And the other reason for writing it is there are many systems issues that interfere with access to effective treatment. And so the other part of the book was to address systems issues, identify what they were, and what we might have to do to make those systems issues better.
I imagine there's lots of times that you've thought, actually, this is quite hard work.
I love doing this because of what I can do to help patients, and also just the interest, the fact that things are progressing so rapidly makes it extremely exciting and extremely challenging. So the name of the book is A Short Primer on Why Cancer Still Sucks. Essentially, it can be obtained online through Amazon Books or on my website, whycancerstillsucks.com. Either it can be obtained through either of those sources. And Amazon will typically ship it just a few days after ordering it. So it can be available quite rapidly. And essentially, it's designed to try to cover the entire front of cancer. Like, why is it so common? What are the benefits and limitations of screening? How cancer causes symptoms? What are the treatment options? What things slow us down as far as the myths and legends that interfere with progress? And then the systems issues. So what is the impact of it taking so long to develop new drugs? What are the factors that are responsible for those speed bumps that slow us down? What makes the new therapies so expensive? Why are they so expensive? And what can we do to reduce that? And then I do a comparison of the Canadian health and U.S. healthcare systems and what the strengths are, what the weaknesses are. At the end of that chapter, my conclusion is that I love them both and I hate them both. They both have major issues, but they also have major strengths. And then the final chapter is where the future is going to lie. Why, by a few years from now, things will be much different than they are now, because things have changed rapidly. Things are going to keep on changing rapidly. So a time of great hope and a time of great progress. At the same time, it's a time of great challenges. So each chapter is actually set up with two sections. So one section is a short primer section that's written in lay terms so that anybody with a non-medical background can understand it. And then it's followed by a further detail section that I go into a bit more depth for the people that are interested in more depth, and gives references and things like that. So a bit more technical so that people can get both sides of it. But there are some people that prefer just to read the short primer section because that gives the basics. And to try to make sure that it can be understood by people who are non-medical, the two major people that edited the book for me was my wife, who's an interior decorator, and my stepdaughter, who's an elementary school teacher. So I had to make sure they pointed out any place that was getting too technical. And so that was very helpful to me to try to make sure that people that were non-medical could understand it. So cancer is cells growing that should not be growing. Like ordinarily in our body, cell growth is happening all the time, but it's very tightly regulated. Cells only start dividing when they're supposed to, and they stop dividing when they're supposed to. And in cancer, that regulation is gone, so they keep on growing, and that has major consequences for the body. Just putting pressure on surrounding structures and making them not work, using up lots of energy and things like that. And it can actually occur. Cancer can start in any part of the body, but there's some parts that are much more likely to start than others, particularly tissues that grow a lot, so that in our body, cells are constantly being replaced, nonstop. And it's so any tissue that cells don't divide very frequently will be less likely to get cancer. Any that they divide more frequently, more likely. But almost any part of the body, cancer can develop. But the common ones are things like lung cancer and breast cancer and colon cancer and prostate cancer and things like that. But it can occur anywhere. The reason it happens, the number one risk in getting cancer is to just get older, because all of us have an average of about 37 trillion cells in our body. And an average of 100 billion of them divide every day just to replace old cells that are being damaged or no longer functional. And for each of those 100 billion cells that divide, there's an average of three mutations per cell that divides. So every one of us has an average of 300 billion new mutations in our body every day, which is a huge number. So most of them are not important because either they'll be repaired, or they will not cause any major change in function, or they will make the cell commit suicide and die, or the cell will become what we call senescent. So they're old, they just sit there, they can no longer divide, so they cannot pass on the mutation to other cells, but they're also, so they can still function, but they're not dividing anymore. So the good news is it takes 10 to 20 mutations in one cell for it to become a cancer cell. If it only took one, we'd all develop cancer at a very, very early age, because every time we have another meal, we're causing some new mutations. Every time we take another breath, we're causing some new mutations. And so that it's a fact that it's 10 to 20 mutations in a given cell. That's why most people do not develop cancer until they're older. But it also is why the older somebody is, the higher the risk of getting cancer, because it just gives time to accumulate the number of mutations that are needed to cause cancer. But the things that will increase the risk of developing cancer are anything that will increase the number of mutations in the cell, anything that causes cell damage. So things like cigarette smoking, or excess sun exposure, or processed meats, or air pollution, or radiation exposure, a whole bunch of different things like that. So that's one thing that can do it. And the other thing that does is anything that increases the number of cells dividing, the rate of cell division. So just getting too many calories, being overweight can do it. Being exposed to hormones that drive cell division. All of those things can do it just by increasing the number of mutations, by increasing the number of cell divisions. So the number one way to reduce risk is to reduce the risk of exposure to those things. So it was here that having my wife review it was very helpful, because she kept on reminding me that we all needed to have a good time in life. And so it's not to eradicate all the things that can cause it, but to limit the quantity, like alcohol, which is another important one that increases risk, to limit exposure rather than trying to tie yourself up in a bubble where we're not exposed to anything. But that just helps reduce risk and get through life with enjoying it, but with not quite as high a risk of getting cancer.
Now, you mentioned that mutations can lead to cancer with excess cell division, but they can also lead to the pausing of the cell cycle or destruction of the cell. So if that is the disease, is that it's not a cell that is stopped from dividing or a cell that is killed, how can we get that cancer to stop dividing or kill those cells?
That's right. So the number one way is, if the cancer is already established, to remove it by surgery, to get rid of it, is very important. And that can cure cancers, although it may not. So that anybody with cancer, there are millions of tumor cells circulating in the bloodstream that have been shed from the cancer, but many of them are sick and they die. And that's why cancers can be cured. But if any of them were able to lodge and survive in other areas, then after the cancer is removed by surgery, then those will start growing later as metastasis, and that will make the cancer incurable because you cannot remove them all. So that's one way to do it, though, is by surgery. Another is radiation. So radiation damages the genetic material in cells. And again, normal cells can repair a lot of that damage, and cancer cells also can. But the techniques that are used in radiotherapy increase the probability that it will kill cancer cells over normal cells. And so that by doing that, some cancers that cannot be cured by surgery may be cured by radiation. Or if the cancer is already spread and is causing symptoms, then the radiation can shrink the cancer in some cases and improve symptoms, even if it cannot cure the cancer. If we move on to when the cancer is more advanced, if it's already widespread and cannot be cured, then what are called systemic therapies are used. And they're called systemic therapies because they go through the bloodstream and they go everywhere in the body, and they may be able to kill cancer cells, shrink cancers, and improve life expectancy, and improve symptoms, and improve quality of life. So the first one of the early types of systemic therapies was chemotherapy. Again, it damages the DNA or other parts of the cell, so it actually can thereby kill the cell. And the only chemotherapy drugs that are useful are ones that are more effective at killing cancer cells than are killing normal cells. And there's a whole variety of reasons why they might have a preferential activity against cancer cells. But in most cases, they cannot cure the cancer, although there are some very specific examples where they can. So some acute leukemias and lymphomas, chemotherapy can actually cure, they can eradicate it completely. Metastatic testicular cancer, there are many patients that can be cured with chemotherapy. Or what are called gestational choriocarcinomas, which is essentially a malignant pregnancy. Many of those can be cured by chemotherapy. But the common cancers like breast cancer, colon cancer, lung cancer, etc., cannot be when they're widespread. We may be able to improve the chance of cure of the cancer being removed by surgery just by eradicating the very small tumor deposits in other parts of the body, or we may be able to make radiotherapy work better with chemotherapy. We usually cannot cure the cancer if it's widespread, but the chemotherapy can prolong life expectancy, can improve the quality of life, because the improvement in symptoms from the cancer outweighs the side effects in the average patient. So it can be beneficial. The other way to do it with systemic therapies is hormonal therapies, so that cancers that are driven by hormones in the body, like some breast cancers, some prostate cancers, if we interrupt those hormones, then we can get the cancers to shrink. And again, so this can be very effective. So metastatic widespread breast cancer, for example, drugs like tamoxifen and the aromatase inhibitors can be quite effective. For prostate cancer, antiandrogens, things that antagonize the testosterone, can make them shrink and can be quite valuable. And then the other new class of drugs that came along about 20 years ago were the targeted therapies. As mutations occur in cells, it results in the production of abnormal proteins that are driving the cell growth. And these targeted therapies specifically block those abnormal proteins. And so that the targeted therapies also, their evolution also led to the whole field of personalized therapies or precision medicine, because it's only the person has a very specific mutation that these drugs will work, but they will work much better than chemotherapy if that mutation is present. So that now, for example, a patient with lung cancer who has a ROS1 fusion gene, I can use a drug that is much more effective than chemotherapy, but it's only 1% of patients that I can use it in. So then we have to do very specific molecular testing, looking for presence of these mutations before we start treatment, because if these mutations are there, we'll be able to come up with much better treatment than just treating with chemotherapy. But if the mutation isn't there, then the targeted therapy won't work at all. The other part of systemic therapy is immunotherapy, things to unleash the immune system against the cancer. And back when I first started my oncology training back in 1976, it was thought that immunotherapy was about to cure all cancers. But the problem is there was a huge amount of hype and hyperbole and very little things that actually worked. And so I became quite disillusioned with immunotherapy. And I used to tell the trainees that immunotherapy has been about to cure cancer for the past 50 years. But then something radical happened in about 2014 and 2015. And that was the checkpoint therapies, the PD-1, PD-L1 inhibitors that suddenly could turn on the immune system and were highly effective in some patients. So they worked in about 10 to 20% of patients with a wide range of cancers, and they could work much better than chemotherapy in those 10 to 20% of patients. But again, in people and other patients where they didn't work, it was like giving a patient a placebo. So we could not predict they were going to work in, but they could be a marked benefit in those 10 to 20%. It's like you want to get more power into your house to turn on the lights. You keep loading more and more power into the power lines, but nothing happens. And that was the early days of immunotherapy, people trying to load more and more power into the power lines and nothing happening. And then somebody just comes along, flips a switch, and all the lights come on. And that's what these drugs do. They flip the switch to be able to turn on the immune system. And we're rapidly learning more and more about why they don't work when they do not work, and finding other new ways of doing this. So this is something that could have a very profound impact. It already has a very profound impact. This class of drugs, the immune checkpoint inhibitors, have been effective against a broader range of cancer than any new therapies that have come along since the drug cisplatin back in the 1970s. So this had a major impact on cancer, and there's reason to believe that it could get better and better.
Yes, your book covers the surgery, radiotherapy, and targeted therapies in quite a bit of depth through chapters 3 through 7. I'm going to skip ahead to chapter 11 and ask you a question about the cost effectiveness of those treatments, because you mentioned targeted therapies and immunotherapies there towards the end. And whilst they are, like you say, having some very profound effects for some people, how is that cost being matched against the actual life years that people gain? Because if we are spending hundreds and thousands of pounds on years and years of treatments, then are people getting, well, years and years of benefit out of that?
This is very, very important, is the cost in both toxicity and also the dollar cost. And the cost of the medications has escalated rapidly over the past several years. And this is because a major driving factor is just the cost of new drug development. There's a bigger cost to not getting the medications because these drugs do prolong useful life and also alleviate suffering. Then if there's delays in getting them, then there are thousands upon thousands of life years lost. One life year is one person being alive 1 year. So thousands of life years lost while there's delays, and also suffering that did not have to happen because these drugs would have improved the suffering. One of the things that most governments do when they consider bringing these drugs offering to patients is looking at the cost of per life, quality adjusted life years. So they look at that and deciding whether they should bring the drugs on and how much they should pay for them. This is good, but it's also problematic because those negotiations also slow access to these drugs after the drug has already been approved by the licensing agencies. It may take a long time before most patients can access it. So this is a big problem because in the old days, many years ago, we would all pay for treatment out of our own pocket and we'd make the decision whether it was worth it or not. Now it's somebody else that's making that decision. And this is a big problem, just that it's somebody else making the decision. But we can't escape it because of the high cost. Most people would not be able to pay the cost themselves. But there are things that we can do to bring down the cost while improving access.
Now, to circle back to some of the earlier chapters in the book, there's something that I think is very important to discuss, and the non-clinical offerings of cancer cures or solutions to disease is very important, and it's something that means a lot to a lot of people facing a very big threat to their life. So why people are either vulnerable to this non-medical exploitation or why people are doing it to them.
Yeah, so you're very right that patients are desperate. And so they come to see me and I tell them that cancer is not curable and their average life expectancy without chemotherapy is 4 months and with chemotherapy about 1.5 years. And then their neighbor tells them about how they cured themselves just by drinking water from the Rideau River. People are desperate, so they will listen to these things. Although many patients understand also that this issue. And I've often told people that if you want to make $1 million, you just write a book about how you can cure cancer by just doing Tai Chi or things like that, or by that people are very vulnerable. So as far as the alternative therapies are concerned, they're alternative because there's no proof that they are a benefit. That doesn't mean that none of them ever will be a benefit, but the claims that are being made for them are not substantiated. And if any of them were found to be valuable, then we would unequivocally endorse them. Just like we tell patients to eat diets that are rich in fruits and vegetables, we tell patients to get lots of exercise. Patients with heart attacks or strokes, we tell them to take low-dose aspirin, cheap low-dose aspirin daily. If those same things were available for cancer, we would unequivocally make use of that and use it. But the things that we do not endorse is because the proof's not there. Often there's a good logic to it, or it sounds like good logic, but it just doesn't hold together, and it just doesn't. There's just nothing there. And so again, some people, it's just well-meaning people that are doing this, but some are also making a fortune. Like I had one patient that she came to me, and I told her that despite her treatment, the cancer was still growing, and she said, "Well, it can't possibly be growing. My marijuana dealer, he's giving me $800 worth of marijuana a week, and he told me that it will cure my cancer for certain." So this is a problem when people are being sold things that is making somebody else rich, but they're desperate and is giving them false hope. This is not good. The other thing that we run into is that patients will tell their story and they will convince everybody else that they cured themselves. So I remember one woman talking to her at a party. She said that she had cured herself of cancer. And I asked her, what kind of cancer? And she said, well, I'm not sure. Well, what did they biopsy? Well, they didn't do a biopsy. Well, when they did the scans, where's the cancer? Well, they didn't do a scan. But I just knew I had cancer because of the way I felt. And so I cured it by taking these drugs. So that's one brand of it. Another person who was working at our condo convinced my wife that he cured himself with an alternative therapy. So my wife told me that I should expand my horizons by talking to him. So I did. So I had a careful conversation with him. He really had cancer. But it was one that's highly curable by radiotherapy, and he'd had high-dose radiation. But he took this alternative therapy, so he told all his friends that he cured it by the alternative therapy, and he forgot to mention that he also had a treatment that would have a high probability of curing it without the alternative therapy. So what these things do, so they make somebody the center of attention, make a good story, but the problem is that they induce other people to, in desperation, do things that are not going to help them. So of all the alternative therapies out there, could any of them work? Possibly, because like many of our chemotherapy drugs came from plants originally, and some of them are plant products, so they might work, but there's just nothing to say that they are working. So it's all just claims without any proof, and we really need the proof that they are working to incorporate them into standard practice.
Well, I think it's also worth considering, as you do in some of the later chapters of your book, the structural means through which people become desperate enough to either seek alternative solutions or become vulnerable to their influence. And you mentioned at the start of the interview that you examine the American and Canadian healthcare systems and find the advantages and disadvantages of both. So I think it's worth always taking the time to reflect on what the barriers to people receiving adequate care are, or being in a position to accept the care that is made available to them, what the shortcomings in that care are, either if it's affordability, time, access, the people, the support around them, or the physical location, if they can get to where, I don't know, linear accelerator for proton therapy is. So we're not just victim blaming people here.
You sure? So, I mean, one of the things with access, again, is new drugs. The fact that it takes an average of 12 years to bring an effective new drug from discovery to market. And these are drugs that can prolong life and alleviate suffering. So that's a long time. The thing that's driving that long time interval, which is much longer now than it was 30 years ago, is regulation. And the regulation is absolutely essential because clinical research, there's lots of ways that things can go wrong. So the regulation is essential, but we need much smarter regulation to do this. And we know we can do it because COVID, it only took a year to come up with effective vaccines for COVID and 12 years to come up with an effective drug for cancer. And it's all driven by how it's regulated. And so I use the analogy in the book of Germany's Autobahn, where it's got unlimited speed limits, but despite that, it has one of the lowest traffic fatality rates in Europe. And it does that by smart regulation. And so we need our regulation to be much smarter so that it permits rapid progress, just like it did with COVID vaccines, but while also maintaining safety and data integrity and things like that. So we need that. Then once the drug is approved, then drug funding. So for the United States, for example, then once it's approved by the FDA, it's almost instant that's available to patients because the FDA and the American government have a deal with drug companies that whatever the drug company is going to charge, they'll pay it and they'll get immediate access. In Canada and Europe and other countries, there are long processes to then figure out who's going to pay for it and how. And that happens fastest in countries like Germany and Switzerland. It takes much longer in Canada and New Zealand and Portugal for that to happen. And again, if people cannot access it to these drugs because nobody's paying for them, then again, that's thousands of life years lost and thousands of people that are suffering because they would not have to suffer if they had access to these drugs. So we've got a huge problem in Canada in particular, but also New Zealand and some other countries do, just figuring out what the funding process should be to get these drugs funded faster. And it's not as if it can't be done, because if Germany can do it, Canada can do it. If the UK can do it, then Canada can do it, but we're not. And so this is a major, major problem. And it actually, so in fact, in Canada, if you've got private insurance, then you can get access as soon as Health Canada approves them. But then it takes another year and a half to get the public funding. And who has private insurance? Well, many of the people that are doing the negotiating on behalf of government have private insurance. So they get access immediately, but the people they're negotiating on behalf of do not get to access until they finish their negotiation. So this is a problem. The other thing also is that just the time from the suspicion of a cancer until the documentation of cancer, the staging, all the diagnostic things, the molecular testing, etc., there are delays during that time period before treatment can be started. And for some cancers that are localized and are potentially curable, the probability of dying from the cancer goes up by more than 1% per week of delay in getting the treatment started. Or if you've got a metastatic cancer, for a metastatic non-small cell lung cancer, for example, then for every week of delay in getting the treatment started, 4% of remaining patients die during each remaining week. And many others become too sick to even think of undergoing treatment. So that this is important to make things happen very, very rapidly. But in Canada, it takes too long because we've got fewer CAT scanners per million population than Turkey or Greece or many of the Eastern European countries. We've got very few hospital beds compared to other countries. We've got fewer specialists per million population than most other countries. So in Canada, it takes too long to just get all the upfront testing done and to get to the treatments started. And so this is very, very important. But across all countries, it takes longer than we would like to see it take. But there's some countries that it takes longer than others. And so access is a major problem. So when I discuss the difference between the Canadian and American healthcare system, for example, I point out that the probability of surviving cancer is about 67% of all Americans will survive cancer. You look at all cancers, compared to about 62% of Canadians or 63% of Canadians. So that 4% difference does not look large, but that's been consistent over many years. And if you look at the number of patients, Canadians who die of cancer, if that 4% extra death rate was not there, that would mean about 9,000 fewer deaths from cancer across Canada if the average Canadian just had the same access as the average American. On the other hand, there are other things that Canada does much better. So that the reason that for the United States, despite having the most expensive healthcare system, the reason that their average life expectancy, they rank 46th, just ahead of Albania, is because they've got a problem with providing access to young people, because young people are often not insured. And if a young person dies of something that they could have been saved from, that has a much greater impact on your average life expectancy than if an older person dies. And also in the United States, because of the lack of access of young people, they've got one of the highest maternal death rates and one of the highest infant death rates in the Western world. And this is very bad that this happens. And also there's other things outside the healthcare system that also increase the probability of young Americans dying. So the deaths from drug overdoses, much higher in the United States than in Canada. Deaths from traffic accidents, much higher in the United States than in Canada. Death from homicides, about 5 times higher in the United States than Canada. And also, being in prison will take an average of 5 years off your life expectancy. An American is 6 times more likely to be in prison than a Canadian. So that these other things outside the healthcare system that have a major negative impact in the United States than compared to Canada. So I would love to have Canadians have the same rapid access to diagnosis and treatment for cancer as the Americans, but many of the other things in the healthcare system I prefer to see the way it's done in Canada.
Well, on a hopefully optimistic note, the last chapter of the book, chapter 15, is looking at the future of cancer care, cure, kind of the onset and etiology of it. Is there anything that you do see as a hopeful development in the near future for cancer care, or in changes to society, access and equity in healthcare provision, perhaps?
Yeah, so what I point out in the book is that my mentor, the head of our department, when I went down to MD Anderson Hospital in Houston for training, his name was MLJ Freireich, and he was one of the most brilliant people that I've ever met. But he had Freireich's laws, and one of Freireich's laws was the only people who come close to predicting the future are the science fiction writers, and they always underpredict rather than overpredicting. At the time that he told us that, none of us ever thought we'd be walking around with phones in our pocket, or we would no longer need a map because a computer in a car would be talking to a satellite. And yet, all these things happen in a very short period of time, and things are happening very, very rapidly. So there's been a very rapid progress in the number of new drugs available, and just a concept about what we can do for this. So that, as I said, I think that immunotherapy, that we have the potential to make huge advances for screening for cancer, like right now, mammography and colonoscopy and things like that. They certainly improve the probability of being cured of a cancer or not dying from a cancer. But in the future, it's going to be a blood test that will pick up things when they're very early and much earlier than the current screening methods. So that's going to be the future. Right now, we give adjuvant treatment, so chemotherapy in people that have undergone surgery to reduce the risk of the cancer coming back again. In the future, it'll be much different. We'll do a blood test to see whether any circulating tumor cells that are still left after the surgery. If there are, that means that there are tumor deposits in different parts of the body. So those people will treat for minimal residual disease, whereas if there are no residual cancer cells, there'll be a very high probability that patient's already cured, and we will not have to give them any further treatment for the cancer. We can just watch them. So those types of things. In the future, coming back to immunotherapies, so that there's a new class of immunotherapy drugs called bispecific T-cell engagers, which is monoclonal antibody that one arm attaches to a tumor cell, the other arm attaches to a T lymphocyte, which is part of the immune system, brings them close together so the T lymphocyte can destroy the tumor cell. I foresee the future that these will be customized drugs that will be made on the spot for you, where it will depend on what your tumor cells have on it that will make this bispecific T-cell engager stick to it. So instead of it being one drug developed to help a million people, it'll be a new drug that's made right then and there for you that is very specific to your tumor. So all the technology currently exists to do these types of things. And if we can imagine it, then we can do it. It's going to take time. It's going to take maybe decades. But these types of things are things that could very well be coming in the future. As far as the whole access thing, so I point out in the book that many things are judged driven by tipping points. And eventually we will come to the conclusion that things are just not right in how we're developing drugs now. It takes much too long, it takes much too long to fund them. It takes much too long for diagnosis. These are tipping points that once we reach them, we can do something about these things. And in fact, if we intercede early in the disease, it may be much cheaper than waiting until it's late and then interceding later. And so this is the mind shift that we've got to get, where right now we look at therapies and tests and things like that being expensive. But the alternative is much more expensive, that not finding things when they're early, not offering treatments early on. This is that's much more expensive than having effective treatments available early on. So we're in a much different place now than we were 46 years ago when I started my oncology training. Much different. We've made huge progress, but we still have a long piece to go, but we are going to keep on making progress. So there is hope that things are rapidly getting better They're going to keep on rapidly getting better. And so that's the important thing. And everything we can do to speed that up is going to be beneficial. So that's where chapters 11, 12, 13, 14 come in. How do we make these things much better, much faster? Well, what I tell all my patients with cancer, if you've got cancer, just tell them, well, they have to be prepared for the fact that things could go badly very quickly, or there's also a possibility they could be doing great years from now. They just can't predict. All we can do is take it day by day and trudge along. And I also tell my patients that optimism does not make treatments work any better, but it makes the quality of life a lot better. So you might as well be optimistic. As far as the book is concerned, again, you can, the name of the book, Why Cancer Still Sucks, a short primer on why cancer still sucks, and available through Amazon Books and a whole bunch of other websites, so that through other groups that sell books, or also through my website, whycancerstillsucks.com, and that has a link to a number of different people that are selling it. So that the proceeds from the book, if I ever make a profit on it, I'm going to have to sell about 3,000 copies of it to make any profit. But if I ever do, then so those profits are going to be shared with groups like the Life Saving Therapies Network, Lung Cancer Canada, Canadian Cancer Society, and other people if they agree to accept a share of the profits from the book.